Hi everyone, welcome to Off the Podium. I have Dr. Rob Haskins joining you from New Hampshire.
Hello.
Welcome to Off the Podium.
Thank you for having me.
How's it been, Rob? How's the sabbatical, the time off from teaching? Because you've been doing intensive teaching for many years now, right?
Well, we have a sabbatical every 7 years,
Uh-huh.
and I started in 2004, had my first sabbatical, I guess, in 2011, and then taught straight through with one semester off for a research fellowship until this semester. But it's always, a sabbatical is always an amazing moment when you can really just focus on your own work. It's one of the nice things about academia.
Yeah.
And what I've been doing at this moment, there are kind of three big projects that I'm trying to get some progress on. One is a short cultural history of the piano
Uh-huh.
for Reaction Books, who published my John Cage book.
Uh-huh.
And the second is a series of essays on John Cage that I'm co-editing with Seth Brodsky and David Nichols.
Uh-huh.
That will be sent to peer review for Northwestern University Press. And then finally, Professor Andy Boysen here and I are thinking of collaborating to do a textbook on the history of wind literature. Because that's a book that needs to be written, and it hasn't been written yet.
Yeah. When I said let's talk, and we've never actually, for the listeners out there, I must say that we've never actually talked on Skype or on the phone. Is that correct?
We tried once, and the time just didn't work out. Either I was wrong about the time it was supposed to happen, but whatever happened, we didn't get to talk.
Uh-huh.
And I always felt, I'm sorry I missed that opportunity. So this is great. I finally get a chance to make good on that plan we'd had a long time ago to do that.
Yeah. Okay, well, the things that you sent me when I said let's have this chat on the podcast, a lot of them were John Cage related. A lot of them were, mentioned John Cage. So it was very John Cage. What's the inspiration behind this, and why the fascination maybe with John Cage?
Well, I have had a very long acquaintance with John Cage. And when I first became aware of who he was, my initial reaction was quite negative.
Uh-huh.
And this goes back to the age of 10 years old.
Mm-hmm.
When I began to be interested in music,
Mm-hmm.
and a pastor at my church
Mm-hmm.
gave me a music appreciation textbook. And it was called, I believe it was called The Understanding of Music.
Mm-hmm.
And it was by Charles Hoffer. And I read this book very, very carefully from start to finish. And in the 20th century chapter, when we got to John Cage, there was a picture of him holding one of these little toys, like a Fisher-Price toy that makes noise. And he had this goofy smile on his face.
Uh-huh.
And I read about 4 minutes and 33 seconds, and I said, this guy wants to destroy music. And then when I became an undergraduate, I remember at Peabody Conservatory twice trying to find pieces of music by John Cage to listen to.
Mm-hmm.
And every time I did, the recordings were usually really, really bad.
Uh-huh.
And did not show the music in its best light.
Yeah.
So I couldn't make a connection.
Yeah.
And the whole idea of chance music to me seemed a strange concept.
Uh-huh.
To let so many aspects of a piece of music go and not be in control of them. Then we're moving ahead in time to the year 1991, or must have been 1990 or 1991.
Uh-huh.
And a dear friend of mine named Laurel Carlick Sheehan moved back to Baltimore. She had gone to school with me in Baltimore, Peabody. Then she left, and she was living in Toronto for a long time, and she came back to Baltimore. In the meantime, she had given the Canadian premiere of a two-piano piece by Cage called 2-2. 2 superscript 2.
Yeah.
And she said, I did this piece. Would you like to play it here? And I said, yes, I would. Mm-hmm. And the way Laurel and I work together is we get together, we rehearse a lot. It's a luxurious ability we have to rehearse. I think we must have rehearsed this piece before we performed at least 20 hours, maybe more. And the strangest thing happened as we were rehearsing, and that was I was playing, it's all chords or single tones.
Uh-huh.
And I became aware that certain of these very interesting complex chords, some of them not so complex, kept coming back over and over again. And I thought, but this is supposed to be chance music.
Yeah.
I thought that was totally random.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's that set something off in me.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I was drawn to in this piece and others from this period were the harmonies, because I've always been fascinated by the harmony of music. And in this music, as he famously said, I finally found a way to write harmony. And I kept thinking and thinking and thinking about that phrase all through my doctoral work in musicology. And at the end of my PhD coursework, when I had to figure out a dissertation, I kept thinking about different topics, never the Cage topic. I thought about doing Mozart, I thought about doing a Bach topic, and for several, well, I don't want to say several years, but for a long time, I was doing research on Bach harpsichord concertos, and that ended up not going anywhere. And this dear friend of mine, a percussionist named Alex Pastelnik, said to me, why don't you write about Cage? You've always liked him. And I said, yes, I could do that. So it was those various experiences. Those are always in my mind when someone asks me, as you just did, why John Cage? Yeah. And then in the course of thinking about John Cage, and there were many other things about him that became very interesting and meaningful to me, not least his interest in Zen Buddhism. And although I'm not a Zen Buddhist by any stretch of the imagination, I do find a lot of the tenets of Zen Buddhism very appealing.
Interesting. John Cage also had, as you wrote, when I read, and I knew this prior to reading your materials, I knew the John Cage relationship with Seattle, with Cornish College of the Arts, which I attended for 2 years. And how important was Seattle and Cornish College of the Arts for John Cage, if you wanna share a little bit about that?
I think the experience that Cage had in Seattle really started him on a lot of the things that he was particularly interested in as a composer, not least of which was the harnessing of electronic sounds in composition. He wrote the first live electronic piece, The Imaginary Landscape #1, and it was also at Cornish where he refined Henry Cowell's idea of the prepared piano, and with it produced Bacchanal, which was the piece that accompanied, I cannot remember her name, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on her name, a student at Cornish who choreographed a dance to that music, or who had choreographed a dance and to which Cage wrote that music.
Yeah. There was an interesting part I read, and let me find that. It was about Berio and Stockhausen, and you said something along the lines of these composers soon realized that Cage projected, what Cage projected was one that threatened the autonomy of the composers. And what does this mean? Do you actually think they felt the threat from Cage and what he brought to the table?
I do think they both did, and their responses didn't really bear that out as much as the very famous polemical essay by Boulez called Alea, in which he said, if a composer abdicates his composerly responsibilities by relying on chance, that's a major problem. I mean, this article led to the break in the relationship between Cage and Boulez. And Boulez and many of the Europeans were interested in the idea of letting some things go, but also exerting the composerly control on it. So Boulez and others, Ludoslavsky comes to mind, and Berio too. It took the principle and created what they called aleatoric counterpoint. I think that's Ludoslavsky's term. So the music was composed, but the exact order in which it appeared was left up to the performers.
Yeah.
And that was their way of taking, in some ways, domesticating what they thought was a somewhat crude approach that Cage was doing. But by doing that, they really completely missed the point of what Cage was attempting to do, which was not simply to abdicate the composer's role in selecting and ordering sounds, but to open up our ears and our hearts to the idea that if we listen to sound on its own, without being forced to follow the progression of sounds in an order that's prescribed by the composer, then we will have, each and every one of us, our own particular experience of that sound. And in that way, sounds stop becoming obedient to the will of the composer and return to their own natural state, which is a Buddhist. This is a Buddhist idea. Everything around us is potentially something to which we would benefit by paying attention. Yeah. And all the things to which we pay attention are influenced and influencing these other things to which we could pay attention. So the idea that Cage is after is really much more vast than I'm going to abdicate my responsibility as a composer of creating forms and harmonies that originate with my own imagination.
Well, going back to the States, and you talked about this briefly in one of your books, but how important is Cage to American music? And is he one of the most important American composers? Because the other composer you mentioned prior to Cage was Aaron Copland, right? And I also think of, right away when I think of American music, I somehow just associate it with Ives too. So there's so many American composers, but Cage you find very important. Why is Cage important?
I think Cage is important primarily because of all the American composers up to that point. It was principally he who really made a serious impact in Europe. That's one aspect. Yeah. In some ways, he was eclipsed later by Feldman and perhaps by Earl Brown. But the other composers, Ives, Copland, their careers, although Copland was a known quantity in Europe, I don't think he was regarded in his time as a maverick or a true exemplar of the avant-garde. And in his way, what Cage was attempting to do was really very much in sympathy with and in dialogue with the avant-garde tendencies of European composition. Yeah. So that's one aspect. And the other aspect of his importance is the way in which his ideas about music history, about musical style, about the characteristic voice of an American composer really gave many other composers the freedom, and they say this over and over again if you read about this, the freedom to be who they were and to pursue what they were doing. So up to Cage in America, you could go the Stravinsky route, which was neoclassicism, or you could explore the ramifications of 12-tone music. Yeah. So you have those two options. Cage demonstrated, no, there really are more options than just those two. Yeah. There are all sorts of other options, and what I'm doing is only one of those. Yeah. So, for example, minimalists like Phil Glass and Steve Reich say, I am part of your tradition. You may not want to recognize, this is a Glass quotation, you may not want to recognize me as one of your followers, but I am. And what accounts for that is both my willingness to do something that hadn't been done before, and also, in Glass's case particularly so, to explore what it means to experience music in a different way. Because Glass is a Tibetan Buddhist. Yeah, yeah. And the Buddhistic origins in Glass's, especially the really early pieces, have to do with positioning the listener with respect to sounds that aren't necessarily telling a story or illustrating things in the way, Copland's Appalachian Spring or even the Third Symphony. These things present narratives that are very familiar to us. In Glass and early Reich, and to a certain degree, even with their works after 1976 or so, there's a certain narrative, but there's not one. One hears various possibilities in the music, and one must complete the work for his own or her own satisfaction.
Yeah. Well, going back a little bit early, I want to know when Cage was really appreciated by the general public, or by Americans, or by Europeans, because I think it came pretty a little bit later than you would think, right?
Well, there were sort of ebbs and flows in the way he was received in various places. I would say that in America, he probably had only a limited audience, and primarily limited to New York from the time he got there, which is roughly, I want to say 1942, maybe 41, maybe, through the period where he won the Guggenheim and the citation from National Endowment for the Arts for his prepared piano music. He didn't have much of a following outside of that tradition. He was invited fairly early on in the 50s to Donaueschingen, and he made a stir there. But it was only in 1961, when Silence was published, that he became an extremely well-known figure. Many people read and were profoundly inspired and influenced by Silence, not least because it was so beautifully and entertainingly written. It was a book about art, but it was a book that you didn't have to have a specialist knowledge of to be inspired afterwards. That was a profound idea, and I think that's a specifically American one. And it was Cage who really articulated that for the arts. That had a powerful impact. In the 70s, he was quite popular in Germany. In fact, there's a continuing German interest in his music, well past Silence. Whereas Cage's popularity in America reaches the zenith in the year 1960s. This is when his massive multimedia piece called Harpsichord, spelled in computer speak HPSCHD. You wouldn't know this because you're too young. But when computers were first being made, you were limited by a certain number of characters that you could call files. So harpsichord is called Hipskid because you could only name computer files with 6 characters. This was a big thing. It was written up in Time magazine, and people went all over the country to see it. It was a real show because there were films, and there were all these people, and there was amplification and electronic music, which was still a relatively new thing, and this idea of happenings, which was very congenial to the 60s, where you come and your participation really goes a long way in making the piece of art what it is. So after that zenith, there was a decline because Cage started doing different things, and he was never very good at explaining what he was doing, or maybe that's not true. He was not willing to explain what he was doing. He would basically repeat very, very old stories from Silence. And then he'd become somewhat impatient with people if they hadn't read his later books, where you can trace what he's doing. I mean, he wrote six books, I think, in which he's chronicling in various ways his interests. So there was a decline there. And then I would say after 1982, which was his 70th birthday, must have been. Yeah, his 70th birthday, 1982. And then the 75th birthday, 1987, he became again a composer that had great interest among younger composers. This is around the time that Brian Brandt started to put out all the recordings of his music through Mode Records. It was the first really, really fine, beautifully made, sustained recordings of Cage's music and all kinds of music. People were recording Cage's music up to this point, but they focused almost exclusively on early works. Whereas Brian Brandt, the very first release of Brian Brandt's Mode Records was the Etudes Borealis, which was at that time a fairly new piece, 1978, for cello and percussion. And Brian was very heroic, I would say, in bringing out these very late pieces and also some very intractable pieces from the 60s that were little known, like Atlas Eclipticalis. That was, I think, the second Cage release. So there were ebbs and flows, I would say, in Cage's popularity. But once he reached his 80s, if you last long enough to your 80s, people bury the hatchet. And they go, oh, well, he's this nice old man. He had changed a lot in his character between, his 30s and 40s when he was more dogmatic. Yeah. And he was always charming, but he could be kind of harsh. Yeah. By the 80s, he just really didn't give a shit anymore. And he was just going to be who he was. Yeah. And there was increasing interest from all kinds of quarters, from journalists, from scholars, and from performers in his music. And I think that's what really rekindled, in a very important way, a widespread interest in his work.
Yeah, you would know this, but I want to know if there's a Cage now. Is there an American Cage now?
There's a wonderful essay by Seth Brodsky, formerly my classmate at Eastman School of Music and now associate professor at University of Chicago, that deals with the subject of Cage and influence. Oh. And Brodsky is really the expert on influence, widely conceived. And in the 20th century, this is a term that is very problematic and hard to tease out. But to give you my un-Brodsky-esque, non-specialist answer to that question, I'd say, although there may be some composers who incorporate aspects of chance in their music, there really are no composers who are really writing quite the way Cage did. He wrote many different ways. That's one of the reasons. Yeah. But also because he opened up this floodgate in which composers could say, well, I'll write this way, or I'll start writing microtonal music, or I'll explore this small aspect of electronic music, or I'll write minimalism, or I'll write, rock music, but really incorporating a classical sensibility. Yeah. In that sense, many composers are cut from Cage's cloth. Yeah. Brodsky suggests that maybe one of the most clear descendants of or followers of Cage is Helmut Lachenmann.
Oh, okay.
But even in the case of Lachenmann, you've got a composer who is essentially writing the music that he wants to hear. There is an affinity, perhaps. Brodsky could do this so much better than I can. But I don't think there are composers who are saying, as you might say, Schubert comes from Beethoven, comes from Mozart, and Haydn comes from C.P.E. Bach. Yeah. There's no comparable lineage from Cage. There are, I think, greater or lesser affinities.
You said something about specialist knowledge when referring to silence, and in the present day, I go to a lot of these new music, contemporary music concerts in Seattle, so many amazing performers. But one thing that's always depressing to me is the fact that I see 10 people sometimes at a concert of, first off, amazing musicians and also wonderful compositions by a wide variety of composers, whether they're living or no longer with us. But what can we do? I mean, I don't think Cage had a similar problem, but were there similar problems back 50 years ago from your knowledge and expertise on this topic?
I mean, contemporary music has never had a wide audience until the minimalists. The minimalists really changed a whole lot in terms of finding an audience for contemporary music. And that points to the general theory I have about the audience. Let's call it a problem in scare quotes, the audience problem for contemporary music. And that is the composers who are rather intensively seeking the avant-garde, in the sense that they want to find things that have never been done before. They want to find sounds and create forms and create a kind of music that isn't something that you would normally hear.
Okay.
That generation of composers is in many ways the descendant of an idea about what music is and how it should be received that begins much earlier in the 19th century. And I have to apologize. I'm realizing as I'm talking to you, my answers are very, very long.
I love it. I love it. This is what it's about. So go for it.
Sometimes they go a little digressive. But anyway, so this one's going to be even more so.
Go for it.
We have to go back. When we think about Beethoven, we must contrast him with the generation that preceded him. Mozart and Haydn, by and large, did not think of themselves as composers who are writing music that would not be understood in their own lifetime. Mm-hmm. Even Mozart, who was frequently and viciously criticized for music being too difficult by his contemporaries, was drawing upon well-known conventions. He was just adding a little bit more complexity, but the conventions were still there. And Mozart did not imagine that he was writing music that couldn't be understood by his own contemporaries. Whereas, and you probably know this story about the Razumovsky quartets. Mm-hmm. You know this story?
Yeah.
Okay, so that story is...
But please tell us, because there's people out there that might not.
I think it was one of the people who performed first, the Razumovskys, and he said, I don't really understand this piece. And Beethoven just smiled and he said, well, this music is not for you, but for a later age.
Yeah.
That is an unbelievable and unprecedented remark.
Yeah.
But it is a remark that is not completely coming from out of the blue. Mm-hmm. It's expressed also in Kant's formulation of musical genius. Mm-hmm. You know this? Where Kant says genius is primarily related to the arts. And it is something that you're born with. You either have genius or you don't have genius. And the genius artist creates not cognitive ideas like 2 + 2 = 4, but what Kant called aesthetic ideas. Ideas that cannot be explained in words, but that are apprehended by the senses, and which are in that regard equally forceful and powerful as rational ideas. Yeah. Okay, and Kant then went on to say, by apprehending these aesthetic ideas, we normal mortals can come closer to the experience of the genius. Yeah. So Kant in the 1790s is laying the spade work for a sensibility that Beethoven then embodies. Yeah. And as far as I know, he's the first composer to embody it with that level of force and strength. There may be other composers who thought this way, but Beethoven was really the first to state that in an unequivocal way. And so it seems to me that this idea is taking root in the 19th century, and this leads to a way of thinking about music on behalf of performers, audiences, and composers, that our job is to innovate in music. And the more personal our innovations, the better, the stronger the art is. Mm-hmm. All right? That goes all the way through. We can see this. This is echoed strongly in Milton Babbitt's famous essay, Who Cares If You Listen, which he called The Composer a Specialist. And, Babbitt maybe was a little bit impatient, and maybe he could have said what he had to say in a less confrontational manner. And later on, in a 1980s interview, he did try to soften the imperious tone Who cares if you listen?
Yeah.
But Babbitt was essentially saying, if you don't want to understand my music, then I'm not interested in your response to it.
Yeah.
And he's just saying what Beethoven and others said. They're critics of the Eroica Symphony.
Yeah.
The first criticisms were awful. And then I think 10 years later or so, you can trace it in the Allgemeine Musikzeitung. Mm-hmm. You can see critics then say, yes, this is a complex piece of music, but we must try to understand it.
Yeah.
It has happened in our time. And this is, I think, partly a response of mass media, the ascendance of popular music, which is not a bad thing. I don't want to be misunderstood about this. We are now entering, and have been, in overlap between this 19th century idea and what I feel is primarily a communal age, like the age of the late 18th century, where people who are interested in art, by and large, expect art to have a familiar, conventional aspect that they can grasp, and against which any aberrations, not the best word again, any contradictions to these conventions could be readily understood.
Yeah.
You see this notion very strongly articulated in musicology by Susan McClary's work.
Yeah.
In fact, her Ernst Bloch lectures is called Conventional Wisdom.
Oh, yeah.
And it's all about this and about why it's important for composers like Philip Glass and others to be writing new music, but music that clearly relates to prior, not to prior, but to readily understood conventions.
Yeah.
And I think that the problem we have in many new music concerts is that many composers simply don't want to do this. And, in America and other European countries, we have the right to continue to do whatever it is we want to do in art. And in Europe, of course, art is much more subsidized. So it's easier for composers to do this.
Yeah. Yeah.
In the United States, it's harder. And as a result, you see oftentimes this music being subsidized either by wealthy patrons like Paul Fromm in Baltimore. Randy Rothschild was a big proponent of avant-garde, post-serialist music in particular, and others. And you see the university as an important patron of this new, let's call it difficult music to glom onto the Laurie Anderson song.
Yeah.
And that's existing side by side with these more marketable commercial ventures.
Yeah.
There are both good and bad examples of music in both of these arenas.
Yeah. Well,
but I think, to tie it all back to where I started, I think that most audiences are either afraid to, or unwilling to, or resistant to music which combats so many of their assumptions that they don't know where to begin. Then this was the nice thing about Cage and creating the music that he created, in which, you as a listener figure out what's important in this piece, how to make this piece meaningful to you. You have ultimate freedom. Maybe people don't like that much freedom. And that I think is the position we're in new music, and I think that position is going to continue for the foreseeable future.
Yeah.
I see the composers like Babbitt, Carter, Lachenmann, Riem, my mentor Robert Morris, and others really are heroes in that they are just doing what they were doing, and their audiences are going to be small and specialist audiences, but they are there.
Yeah. Well,
but it's something we have to get used to and accept, I think.
Yeah. Putting the audiences aside, from a professional perspective, and this is something I read in one of your writings, where Cage says the New York Philharmonic is a bad orchestra. They're like a group of gangsters. They have no shame. When I came off the stage after one of the performances, one of them who had played badly shook my hand, smiled, and said, "Come back in 10 years and we'll treat you better." They turn things away from music and from any professional attitude towards music to some kind of a social situation that is not very beautiful. It's the audiences, but it's also the professional musicians. New York Philharmonic is one of the great orchestras, if not the great orchestra in the States. And to get this kind of an attitude towards Cage's music from what he's describing, it's not just the audiences, it turns out, it's also professional musicians. So I mean, we're composers, especially of contemporary music, are in such a tough situation because they have the audience on one side, not maybe enjoying what they're doing, and they have professional musicians at the highest caliber, fighting back against what they're doing. So I mean, it's just I don't even know if you want to respond to this, but it amazes me that some of these composers are put in these situations.
Well, this recalls to me a story by Ralph Shapey. And there's this wonderful book I must recommend to you. It's called Sound Pieces, Interviews with Contemporary Composers. And it came out in 1982. And it was a book that was very important to me as a young student to learn about various approaches to composition that were happening at that time, but also to read maybe for the first time about some of these issues. So Ralph Shapey tells us a great story. I think he was conducting, I want to say he was conducting Chicago, but I may be wrong about this orchestra. Anyway, so they have he was guest conducting, and the Chicago orchestra was really nasty to him. And he was only conducting his own piece. So Martineau was conducting everything else. And the orchestra just let him have it, he says. And afterward, they came up and they talked to him. I might be able to find this quote, because Shapey is so funny. I hate to misquote him. It's quite funny. Here it is. I'll read it at length.
Yeah.
I can tell you a wonderful story. I've lots of stories, and they're all true. They all happened to me. I was conducting my invocation with the Chicago Symphony, and there was this fight going on with Martineau. They were also doing the Carter Piano Concerto, and they were mad. All kinds of crap. Let's face it, American orchestras are the biggest bunch of babies alive. So they told me that they were going to give me a hard time. I was the guest conductor, so they could let me have it. They couldn't let Martineau have it. He was their boss. Well, at one point, I got fed up and walked out of the rehearsal. I said, okay, I'm canceling my piece. The hell with it. I'm not going to take this goddamn crap. Well, the committee and Jean, who insulted you? Blah, blah, blah. And they convinced me to go back on again. Right. At intermission, the concertmaster came up to me and said, when we play a work of yours, we should get double pay. I said, well, that's a very interesting idea. And if I had the money, I'd be glad to give it to you. But why? He said, you know why. I said, I know why, but I want to hear you say it. He said, well, for a work like yours, we have to think, and we're not used to thinking. We don't want to think. Pay us double, and then we can think.
Oh, man, this is amazing.
This is what we're living with, and it's not I don't want this to seem as if I'm condemning American orchestras. But I am saying that the culture of music making in the American orchestra now is one that relies primarily on the 19th century repertoire.
It's sad, isn't it?
That is their bread and butter. Well, the pieces are beautiful. I mean, there's a reason why we keep listening to these pieces over and over again. Yeah. I have no problem with that.
Yeah.
But as you can imagine, if you're a violinist and you're playing, let's say, I don't want to go to Beethoven. Let's say you're playing Brahms 4 for the 50th time or the 100th time. You really don't need to do very much.
Yeah.
You don't even need to watch the conductor in a certain way. You play and, you may say a couple of things, but the piece, by this point, it almost plays itself.
Yeah.
So you do have to work hard as an orchestral musician to be perfect and accurate.
Yeah.
That's not easy.
Yeah.
But in terms of actually engaging in an intellectual way and a creative way, let's say, besides reproducing the notes in the right tempo and the right rhythm with the right dynamics and so on and so forth, that intellection isn't there.
Yeah.
So this is the problem. So when American orchestras are then confronted with new music, especially difficult, hard to count music, such as Elliott Carter or others, it's tough.
Yeah.
It's very, very tough, and they don't get the chance to do it on a regular basis. So one would guess it is almost always equally tough every time.
Yeah.
And that could be stressful.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I kind of understand a lot of the American orchestral musician, but that's this is part of the problem of where we are and the fact that we're in a communal, I think, society as regards the consumption of music and to a certain degree other art forms. Film, for example. Think about the way films were in the 60s and 70s and compare them to today. Very few filmmakers are actually taking very many chances.
Yeah.
There are a few. Most of them aren't mainstream, but there are a few mainstream who are. And the reason that they don't take chances is easy. The cost involved in making a film is so extreme that there's a tremendous pressure to break even on the budget and to exceed it. So how do you do this? You don't present something that's too taxing for your audience.
Yeah. And that brings me to the point of education, whether it's film or arts in general, because there's something lacking in the education in maybe public schools or private schools because we're not getting enough of those people out in the general public. And I'm not talking about musicians, I'm talking about people who are lawyers and dentists and just regular construction workers, people who would have had some kind of a education, so for them to later, maybe in their 30s and 40s, understand, more than just the mainstream, for them to understand the art that will make you think a little bit more than just sit there and enjoy for the moment. So going back to education, what is lacking in the States especially, and what can we do as professionals in this field to make it better, if anything?
I hate to sound very pessimistic about this, but I'm not sure that the educators can do very much because they are swimming against the tide of this communalistic point of view. If it's not immediately digestible, comprehensible, I will be insulted if you have to explain this to me. There's a chip on the shoulders of many Americans and a distrust of intellectuals on the one hand and a distrust of specialists on the other hand. We see this very clearly in the political landscape of today. Exactly. Among other topics, we could talk about climate change. Yeah. We could talk about xenophobia. These are simply more visceral pronouncements of the same trend that we're seeing. It just so happens that America, being perhaps the most capitalistic of all these societies, has gotten here the quickest. Yeah. There seemed to me to be a certain tendency in American politics in the 60s and 70s whereby we wanted to make sure that the educational system was sufficiently modulated so that it did not create free-thinking, potentially disruptive, and dissentious citizens, but placid, patriotic, conservative, socially conservative, intellectually conservative, homespun, just like us, an ordinary kind of guy, kind of politics. Yeah. This explains the rise of people like Sarah Palin, for instance. It's a tremendous problem. Yeah. I agree with you that the solution of it starts with education. If the tide can be turned at all, it can only be turned through education. How would that education happen? I think we'd have to really sit down and really rethink what it is education is supposed to accomplish. Yeah. It's not simply the mastery of facts and techniques, but it is using facts and techniques to think critically about our world.
Yeah. Going back to Cage, for people who don't know Cage, there are some listeners. I don't know if my brother knows. For example, my brother is a big follower of my podcast, but he's not a musician. And he loves listening to these things and learning about all the different things. So I think we've talked about Cage with him, but for someone like him or for others, or even musicians who are not fans of Cage, one piece that you would recommend for the non-Cage fans, non-Cage listeners to listen to, and please don't say 433.
No, I won't. There are many pieces I could pick, and I have to think about it and see.
And maybe reasons why.
I think one piece that I will talk about two.
Perfect.
The first is Roratorio. This was the piece he did at EarCom in, I think it was 1977 or 1978, maybe 1979. Yeah, it was 1979. And it's him reading some poetry that he made from James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, accompanied at chance-determined points in the score by sounds that would have been heard by characters in the wake or that were mentioned in the wake. I think this is a very lively, fascinating piece of music because there's so many things to listen to that you could listen to it several times without hearing everything in it. And there's a certain freedom and catholicity of sounds in the piece. So there's a little snippet of what sounds like an aria, there's laughter, there's dripping water, and then there are other less familiar sounds. And there's also the sound of Irish folk music that's being played all at the same time. I love that. So it's really an instance of you can't listen to one thing, you listen to everything. And it's up to you to kind of make some sense out of it, but there's no right answer here. Yeah. I think that's an exciting piece. Many people that I've played that piece for, they have enjoyed. Okay, so then the other one is a later piece, and it's called 14, and it's for bowed piano and 13 orchestral instruments. And this is one of the more placid number pieces, so it's very sustained sounds of various colors, and there's a certain meditative quality about it. But again, there's this feeling that you don't have to understand it in this particular way that you're not getting because it's too complex. Yeah. You can just let the sounds affect you however they do. Of the chance pieces, those are the pieces that I would recommend. Of the music before chance, the piece I would recommend would be sonatas and interludes for prepared piano, which I really think is Cage's, maybe his greatest piece from that period for sure. I'm fond of some other ones, so I can't say it's his greatest piece of all, but it's up there. It's in the top 10 of his greatest pieces.
Yeah. Well, on a lighter note, what does Rob Haskins do on his time off from music?
Rob Haskins sometimes goes to see movies. I like to read various things, and I have a certain guilty pleasure when I read, and also sometimes when I watch television. I don't watch new TV shows. I tend to watch older ones. One show that I watched when I was a child, I continue to watch to this day. It's called Dark Shadows. It was a Gothic soap opera. It was broadcast Monday through Friday on ABC at 4 in the afternoon. And the characters included a vampire, a witch, a ghost, a werewolf, a mad doctor, a Frankenstein monster, and other people. You know, a doctor, a professor, a rich recluse, a troubled rich daughter, and every kind of ordinary girl who grew up the daughter of a visual artist and was working at the local diner. So these two worlds collide in this spectacular, somewhat goofy way, right? And it was a landmark series for many reasons, not least of which it was one of the first soap operas to use orchestral music, recorded orchestral music, but orchestral music as opposed to organ. Yeah. In those days, electric organ was often used to accompany these shows. Okay, and then another show that I watch a lot of, and I'm watching again now, is Fringe.
Oh, okay.
So I'm a big fan of science fiction, horror. I love these things. Um, Books I'm reading lately, I like to read novels. The book I finished most recently was Paulo Giordano's The Solitude of Prime Numbers, which I highly recommend, but I will warn you, it's one of the most depressing books you will ever read. I don't make a steady diet of depressing books, but this one I made an exception for because it's just so incredibly done.
Yeah, well, last part of this is I've been trying to incorporate some interesting questions, and I wanted to ask Proustian style or maybe Bernard Pivot style questions, and quick answers. You don't have to elaborate on it, but your idea of happiness.
Hiding in Indian food.
What is your favorite word?
Think.
Least favorite word?
Habit.
What sound or noise do you love the most?
Purring.
The one you don't like at all?
Fingernails on a blackboard.
Oh man. What profession other than the one you have now would you have done if you were to pick another career?
Actor.
Wow. Any questions that we've missed? Anything that you want to discuss? And I know this whole thing was about Cage, but we have to do this again. And I want to talk about your career. And the thing that I loved and I realized about you was the fact that you have like 7 or 8 degrees, which
Yes.
you have a PhD and a DMA. I had a hard enough time getting to my DMA program. You have a PhD, a DMA, couple of masters, couple of bachelor's degrees. You're amazing. I can't believe it.
There's a story behind that too, but we can talk about that another time. Yeah, it would be nice to talk sometime about my thoughts about music criticism, and in particular, the period instrument movement.
Yeah, and the thing is that I had something about that, but we never got to it. And we'll talk about this. We'll talk about more next time.
Yeah, let's do it again.
Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me.